Hello everybody, my name's Kelly. First I'd like to start by with acknowledgement of country. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So as I said, my name's Kelly. I'm Dr. Kelly Ellett. I'll be the moderator today. Welcome to the webinar, which will be our second last webinar on exploring young people and anxiety. It's a great topic today, but before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just go through a couple of housekeeping items. The first one is just to let you know that we are recording the webinar today, and it'll be available in a couple of weeks' time on the website, and we'll send an email to you once the recording is up and available. During the webinar today, you'll have the opportunity to write any questions or comments you might have in the screen that will be on your computer. And we'll try to address as many of those questions as we can, depending on time at the end of the session. There'll also be a poll during the presentation, so if you just click your answer when you see the poll appear on your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shona Francie. Shona and I have worked together for a number of years now here at Orygen. She's a clinical psychologist currently working as a clinical educator at Orygen, the National Centre of Excellence in Youth Mental Health. And she has more than 30 years experience in public mental health, first beginning to work in the field of early intervention for psychosis. Way back starting in 1992 when the Early Psychosis Prevention and Intervention Centre, or EPIC as many of you know it as, was first established. Within EPIC and the wider Orygen clinical program, she's held several roles including case manager, group program leader, service lead psychologist and clinical stream leader at both EPIC and the PACE clinic, which is our clinic for young people who are at ultra high risk for psychosis. So I'll now hand over to Shona to start her presentation.
So thanks very much, Kelly, and welcome everyone. So yes, my webinar today is on social anxiety, stigma, and early psychosis. And you might have seen the learning objectives that were around with the advertising for the webinar. So what we're going to look at is social anxiety in young people with psychosis, and but starting from a bit of a broader perspective than that. We're going to explore the relationship between social anxiety, paranoia, and stigma in young people with early psychosis. So that's both people with first episode psychosis and people meeting criteria for being at ultra high risk of developing psychosis. And we'll also explore intervention approaches for young people with social anxiety and psychosis. But I thought it would be good to start with a case study. So I'd like you to listen and, if you like, read about this case study, and there is going to be just a short poll question at the end of the case study. So this is the case of Marcus. Marcus was a 19-year-old university student who was referred by police and the CAT team after behaving oddly in a local pub and being restrained. So it was reported that he'd been dancing on tables and that he jumped behind the bar and was serving free drinks to everyone who was present, which of course caused great consternation to the bar staff. At this time, he'd been attempting to return to a regional university, so he was living away from home after he had deferred for 1 year from that course. So other history, his parents had separated when he was 5 years old. His mother had died 3 years prior to this event of breast cancer, and his father suffered intermittently from depression since since before Marcus was born. So he came into our service and was assessed over a few sessions, and the assessment revealed that he had quite marked thought disorder. So he had trouble maintaining a logical sequence of thought. He had paranoid and grandiose delusions that were quite complicated. So he had ideas that he was able to control gravity and the planets, but also that people were following him and trying to harm him in some way he wasn't clear about. He also described significant cannabis and alcohol use over the last 12 to 18 months. And associated with that, well, may not be associated with that, but he also had a drop in functioning over the last 18 months. He also reported an untreated psychotic episode 12 months ago, from which he'd spontaneously recovered without any treatment. So he was seen in the service, he was seen in the service over 18 months, but over the first 3 months of treatment, his substance use, his thought disorder, and his paranoia resolved, but he remained socially isolated, and he developed some symptoms of depression. So he had poor sleep, poor appetite, low energy, poor motivation, and reported feeling hopeless. He also described long-standing social anxiety, and currently reported having a strong fear of finding himself having nothing to say in conversations, of stammering or stuttering when he would have conversations with people, and appearing crazy. So this was causing him to avoid all social contacts except his father, with whom he had returned to live. So here's your poll question. What seems to be the problem causing Marcus the most difficulty and inhibiting his recovery presently? So answer 1 if you think it's psychotic symptoms, 2 if you think it's depressive symptoms, 3 if you think it's social anxiety, and 4 if you think it's substance use problems. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to respond. Okay, so I think you've got those results on your screen as well. So we've got 68% saying social anxiety, next 15% the psychotic symptoms, and then equal for depressive symptoms and substance use problems. So, okay, I mean, that was a little bit of a staged kind of question, really, because given the topic for the webinar today, social anxiety is the answer that I was expecting, and in fact, most of you have endorsed. So currently, Marcus's psychotic symptoms were under control, and he had his substance use problems were also under control. His depressive symptoms, yes, were still an issue at the time that we're reporting, but I would have a hypothesis that addressing his social anxiety would go some way to addressing his depressive symptoms as well. But thanks for doing that poll. So now moving on to having a look at social anxiety. What do we actually mean when we're talking about social anxiety? So social anxiety disorder, which was previously known as social phobia, is a very common psychiatric disorder. It's the third most common of all the psychiatric disorders, with depression being the most common and alcohol dependence coming second. So the lifetime prevalences for social anxiety are reported in different studies at around 20%, 17%, and there's a couple of lower percentages listed there. So DSM-5, so that's the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders produced by the American Psychiatric Association, says that someone with social anxiety disorder is fearful or anxious about or avoidant of social interactions and situations that involve the possibility of being scrutinised. So that's fearing that he or she will act in a way or show anxiety symptoms that will be negatively evaluated. So it's very much this fear of being negatively evaluated by others. And we can think of social anxiety as running on a continuum from shyness, which is really a personality trait that many people have, up to a diagnosable disorder. And really, whether social anxiety or shyness is a problem depends on how much it's impacting on people's functioning. So to be completely clear about what the current diagnostic criteria for social anxiety disorder are, according to the DSM-5. So it's marked fear or anxiety specific to social settings in which a person feels noticed, observed, or scrutinised. So typically, the individual will fear that they will display their anxiety and experience social rejection, so to be evaluated negatively and to be rejected. Now, public speaking anxiety is, I guess, a classic example. It's something that most people can relate to and most people experience to some extent, perhaps even when you're delivering a webinar. And public speaking anxiety is actually a specific category of social anxiety disorder in the DSM-5. So that's when the anxiety is only produced when performing or speaking in public. So the other diagnostic criteria are that the social interaction consistently provokes distress. So it just doesn't happen once, it happens in all situations of that type. That social interactions are avoided, or if they are endured, it's with great pain and great reluctance. That the fear and anxiety that's produced by the social interaction is thought of as being very disproportionate or out of proportion to the actual situation. That this condition or this reaction to those social events persists for 6 months or longer, so it's something that's been going on for a considerable length of time. And importantly, it causes personal distress and functional impairment in one or more domains, such as occupational functioning, educational functioning, or the interpersonal domain. And that the fear or anxiety cannot be attributed to any other condition, like a medical disorder, substance use, or another mental disorder. So what do we know about social anxiety and psychosis? Well, firstly, we know that it was an area that was neglected for quite a long period of time. So people didn't really think about the occurrence of anxiety disorders within psychotic disorders. And this is possibly due to a couple of reasons. I guess the main one being that the earlier versions of the DSM were more hierarchical in structure, so that it was, for instance, in DSM-3, you could only diagnose an anxiety disorder if it was clearly not evidently caused by another axis 1 disorder such as schizophrenia, and that's of course a hard thing to be really clear about. But over the iterations of the DSM, things have become more relaxed and people have started to look a bit more at anxiety within psychosis. So DSM-5 allows both diagnoses if anxiety is not better explained by another condition. So in the last 20, 30 years, it's become well established that social anxiety disorder is a significant problem for people with schizophrenia, with higher rates within the population with schizophrenia than in the general population. So if you recall, we were looking at 17, perhaps 20% in the general population. So we have reports of 36% in the outpatient population of people with schizophrenia. And in schizophrenia, social anxiety is linked to a wide range of poorer outcomes, such as increased risk for suicide, poorer quality of life, poorer social functioning, lower self-esteem. Some research suggests that social anxiety might be a risk factor for the transition to psychosis in people who meet criteria for ultra-high risk of psychosis, or more generally that social anxiety can be a prominent part of the early phase of the illness for a lot of people. So various psychological theories have been put forward to explain the occurrence of social anxiety disorder, and a prominent one for social anxiety in general is childhood adversity. So childhood adversity such as traumatic events like physical and sexual abuse or maladaptive parenting, or other things that lead to dysfunctional attachment relationships have been implicated in studies as involved in the development of social anxiety. Interestingly, this range of childhood adversity is also linked to adverse outcomes and risk for psychosis as well. In more recent years, it's been theorised that social anxiety disorder might emerge as a psychological reaction to psychosis. So prominent UK research psychologists such as Max Birchwood and Andrew Gumley have proposed and investigated this idea. So the idea is that cognitive appraisals of psychosis as involving a loss of a social role, shame, an adverse or unpleasant social identity, and fear of stigma leads to social anxiety after psychosis. So this idea has gained support from a whole lot of different studies, a lot of them in the experimental psychology paradigm. We're looking at responses to biases and response biases and things like that. So the sorts of things that have been found is that social anxiety itself is not correlated with psychotic symptoms. So it's not the case that the worse the psychotic symptoms, the worse the social anxiety. But it's been shown that social anxiety appears after the onset, so after the onset of psychosis. Various studies have shown us that socially anxious people with psychosis display a greater insight about their illness than those without social anxiety, and that the diagnosis is much more salient, much more prominent in people's thinking if social anxiety is present. We also know that social anxiety is usually accompanied by high levels of depression and increased social disability. So other psychological theories that have been put forward and tested. So there's the idea that social anxiety could be on a continuum with paranoia. So Daniel Freeman proposed this idea. But more recent evidence has suggested that, in fact, they're distinct. So looking at factor analytic studies, that they are actually distinct constructs. And coming back to this idea that social anxiety may occur as a response to psychotic symptoms and also to attenuated psychotic symptoms. So the distinction between social anxiety and paranoia is that social anxiety is the fear of negative evaluation by others, whereas paranoia is the fear of harm by others. It can be quite a difficult distinction to make at times, but that's the one that appears in the literature. So social anxiety, paranoia and auditory hallucinations have all been associated with the use of safety-seeking behaviours, which are aimed at preventing or minimising threat. So they have those factors in common. And they also may share, or at least social anxiety and persecutory delusions, may share common cognitive processes. So studies have shown that they both involve abnormal selective attention to threat-related material, heightened self-consciousness, and heightened response to interpersonal threat. So what about first episode psychosis? So Max Birchwood in particular has investigated social anxiety in first episode psychosis, and just like psychosis in general, has shown that social anxiety disorder occurs at a higher rate in the first episode psychosis population than in the general population, approximately 25%. And Birchwood's work proposes that the development of social anxiety in first episode psychosis is due to the loss of perceived social standing, to the development of shame, and this adverse social identity and the fear of stigma. And investigating within a first episode psychosis population, comparing those with social anxiety and those without social anxiety, his work has shown, Birchwood and his colleagues' work has shown that those with social anxiety have a greater awareness of their diagnosis, greater concern about the diagnosis, report greater shame attached to the diagnosis. They also report feeling put down by others. They tend to report viewing the illness itself as more difficult to control and describe it as inescapable or feeling trapped by the diagnosis. They report more social avoidance, support identifying themselves as a patient, so defining themselves more by their illness than those without social anxiety disorder. So thinking of themselves as someone with psychosis rather than someone who is a student who lives in a certain part of the world. And that those with social anxiety also exhibit strong fear of negative evaluation by others, so stronger than their counterparts without social anxiety. So let's pause for a minute and have a think about stigma. So first of all, some definitions. Stigma, what is it? So it was originally defined way back in 1993 by Goffman as an attribute that is deeply disturbing, which reduces the person from a whole person to a tainted or a discounted one. Stigma is considered a mark of disgrace associated with a quality or a circumstance or a person. Stigma is a set of negative and often unfair beliefs that a society or group hold about something, and it refers to a set of culture-wide beliefs that determine how human attributes are judged and treated. So we have strong evidence that mental illness, especially psychosis and schizophrenia, are severely stigmatised in Western society. People who experience psychosis are one of the most stigmatised minority groups within current society. And in addition, many people with these diagnoses internalise this stigma and so therefore suffer shame and diminished self-esteem on the basis of this internalised stigma about their mental illness and diagnosis. So we have evidence, research evidence about stigma. There's a lot of research that has backed up this idea that the majority of society hold negative beliefs about people diagnosed with schizophrenia and consider them dangerous and unpredictable. A recent report in the UK by the Schizophrenia Commission found that 87% of people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia had experienced stigma and discrimination. A study by Schulz and Angermeyer in 2003 identified that stigma can operate in psychosis in at least 4 domains, such as within interpersonal relationships, with structural discrimination that refers to laws and regulations and Centrelink, social welfare payments, that kind of thing, within public images of mental illness, and with access to social roles. Recently, there's been more studies looking at consumer or server user perspectives about stigma, and a study by Wood et al., it's a colleague of Birchwood's in 2015, showed us that service users report stigma as pervasive throughout society and linked to a whole range of negative things such as social exclusion, devaluation of difference, lack of power and control, lack of understanding, stereotyping and discrimination, inferiority and inequality, shame and secrecy, and importantly, pessimism about recovery. So in fact, service users have reported that the stigma around mental illness is in fact worse than the illness itself, or experienced as worse than the illness itself. So the problem of stigma around mental illness is recognised by governments and by large international bodies like the World Health Organization. For example, the UK government's mental health strategy 2011 to 2015 had one of its 6 key objectives as the need to ensure that fewer people experience stigma and discrimination due to their mental illness. And the World Health Organization's Mental Health Action Plan 2013 to 2020 specifies that people affected by mental illness should be able to participate fully in society and at work, free from stigmatisation and discrimination. So a bit more about stigma and the effects in mental illness. So what we've been talking about so far is the idea that stigma causes or may cause social anxiety. So when mental illness is highly stigmatised, social anxiety may be triggered by the worry about this loss of social status following the onset of psychosis. So because psychosis is stigmatised, it's stigmatising and fear-inducing to feel that one is joining the group, if you like, the group of people with psychosis. This can lead people to try and make efforts to hide the diagnosis. So people want to hide the diagnosis, and we know that hiding something increases anxiety. So we know from studies of eating disorders and diabetes that when people are trying to conceal this, their anxiety goes up. And we also know that if anxiety goes up, it can increase interpersonal difficulties or interpersonal skill difficulties. So in fact, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So where people are trying to hide something, becoming more anxious, they can then become less socially skilled, they can appear unfriendly or disinterested. And that's exactly what they're trying to avoid. There's also some evidence that stigma is responsible for increases in DUP. So that's the duration of untreated psychosis. So due to the fear of the label of a mental illness, families as well as individuals have been seen to deny problems and to not seek help, not seek treatment. And so therefore the initiation of treatment is delayed and the DUP is prolonged. So just a bit more on the effects, the mental health effects of stigma. So other studies have shown us that the stigma of mental illness is associated with lower self-esteem. It delays recovery. We've seen that in the DUP. It leads to social isolation. It's responsible for reduced employment and educational opportunities. It is associated also with poorer physical health care. At times, because the physical health needs of people with mental illnesses are not considered in the same way as people without mental illness. Can lead to or is associated with increased suicidality and higher mortality. And then we've got self-stigma. So self-stigma, we know, is common in mental illness, and it refers to the extent to which individuals with a psychiatric disorder have internalised or applied to themselves the society's beliefs, stigmatising beliefs about the illness. So self-stigma or internalised stigma is a process of identity change. So a person with mental illness loses or gives away their previously held or perhaps desired identity as a partner, a friend, a parent, a particular type of employee, and adopts a stigmatised view of themselves as a damaged, deranged, difficult, a negative view of themselves as someone with a mental illness. The studies have shown us that self-stigma is associated with increases in a whole range of symptoms, so generally symptom severity, positive symptoms of psychosis, negative symptoms of psychosis, and depressive symptoms. Self-stigma has been identified as having major impacts on the individual and once again has been found to be more detrimental than the symptoms of the illness of the psychosis itself. So Max Birchwood has put this together in a model explaining the role of stigma in social anxiety in psychosis. No, my cursor doesn't go on there. So we have the society's stigma about mental illness that is then internalized, which causes people with the mental illness to fear that they may belong to the stigmatized group. That then leads them to worry that they will be judged and rejected by other people. That then causes them to focus in on themselves and become highly self-conscious and worry about how they're looking and how they're sounding. So together, these ideas build up to be a catastrophic shaming belief, if you like, the severe fear that they will be discovered as a mad person, as someone who's mentally ill, and that this belief causes them to behave in certain ways. So they may experience anger and then engage in safety behaviours in order to try and minimise that, which can lead them to avoid things, to be threatening, to look hostile, and so therefore possibly to be rejected, or to be anxious, and then to engage in safety behaviours to try and minimise the anxiety, which leads to behaviours like hiding and avoidance, which can then often, in fact, lead to them not looking or sounding right. So to be this self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's a model of stigma causing social anxiety in psychosis. So let's move on now to think about interventions. So with this model in mind, looking at stigma and social anxiety and psychosis, I think that there are two broad treatment targets that we can think about. One is individual treatment, which I think calls for the modification of traditional treatments for social anxiety to incorporate the issue of self-stigma in psychosis. And then secondly, what do we know about interventions to reduce the stigma of psychosis in society more generally? So just really quickly, let's just remind ourselves quickly about what the evidence-based, what are evidence-based treatments for social anxiety more generally. So a systematic review meta-analysis in 2014 by Mayo, Wilson and et al. Confirmed that the first line intervention for social anxiety is cognitive behaviour therapy, following either the Hindberg or the Clarke and Wells model. Apologies to David Clarke, there's no E on his name. And the second line intervention for social anxiety disorder is treatment with medications such as SSRIs or SNRIs. Before undertaking either treatment according to either model, it's important to do a thorough assessment, to identify the goals of treatment, and to provide information or psychoeducation, if you like, about the disorder and its treatment, including describing the nature and course of the disorder and commonly occurring comorbidities, to examine the impact on social and personal functioning, to look at commonly held beliefs about the cause of the disorder, to look at beliefs about what can be changed or treated, and then to discuss with the patient the choice and nature of the evidence-based treatments available. And then, as I said, the overwhelming evidence is in favour of the Hindberg or the Clarke and Wells model. So the Hindberg model is slightly simpler, involves education about social anxiety, cognitive restructuring, graded exposure in sessions or as homework to the particular feared social situations that the patient has, and examination and modification of core beliefs, and attention to relapse prevention. The Clarke and Wells model is slightly more complicated, but also includes education about social anxiety. It has a particular emphasis on getting people to drop their safety behaviours and to change their severe focus on themselves. So using experiential exercises to demonstrate how they are unhelpful and to learn to behave differently. Clarke and Wells model uses video feedback to correct distorted negative self-imagery. As I mentioned, they do systematic training about getting people to focus externally instead of the extreme self-consciousness that they have. Homework and in-session experiments to test negative beliefs. They do some work around problematic memories of the trauma, of social trauma that are often implicated in the onset of social anxiety disorders. So to re-script, so use cognitive restructuring to think about those possible triggering events in a different way. There's also examination and modification of core beliefs and modification of problematic pre- and post-event processing, and also some attention to relapse prevention. So that's what's recommended and has a lot of evidence behind it, either of those two models, CBT-driven models for treatment of social anxiety disorder. So a couple of weeks ago, the last webinar looked at evidence-based treatment for young people with social anxiety disorder, and I've just borrowed a couple of slides from that webinar by Alex Parker and Steph De Silva, just to remind us that cognitive behaviour therapy is the treatment of choice for young people as well, and that this meta-analysis supported that. A recent meta-analysis from last year reporting that there are moderate to large long-term effects from CBT. Some slight differences when you look at particularly at the young person population, where social skills training is seen as a key ingredient, that CBT provided in schools is seen as more effective than in clinic settings, and that the duration of the overall treatment is seen as more important than the duration of individual sessions. Yeah, and there's some support for the Clarke and Wells model as well. There's also a little bit of support from some newer types of therapy, attention bias modification treatment, although that is a small and short-term effect, and some promising support for mindfulness-based interventions in young people, where just a couple of studies show moderate to large long-term effects and suggest that that's potentially a good way for further investigation with young people. So, what about for the special case, if you like, of social anxiety and psychosis? How do we go about addressing self-stigma? Well, firstly, before the self-stigma theories were developed, there are some studies from the early 2000s demonstrating that group CBT, comprising exposure and cognitive restructuring for social anxiety and schizophrenia, was successful in reducing avoidance and depression. But this focus on self-stigma has led to calls for modifications of conventional CBT for this group, as I've mentioned. The recommendations are that detailed assessment of stigma should always be included when working with people with mental illness, that a focus on shame, entrapment cognitions, negative appraisals of the self and illness, and reducing concealment and other safety behaviours are important to think about. And we know that safety behaviours, which are often avoidance and withdrawal, prevent the disconfirmation of unfounded, anxiety-provoking beliefs, and often have this opposite effect we've talked about, so leading to people appearing unfriendly and socially inept. So evidence, if you like, a systematic review of 9 qualitative studies looking at service users' perspectives on stigma has helped to sharpen the issues that need to be considered in modifications to CBT for this particular group. And in general, they endorse and recommend CBT and also normalising approaches. This review has also pointed to the important role of families in alleviating or worsening stigma. So the attitude of the family to the person or the young person with psychosis is really important in determining how important the stigma is, and they can make it worse or they can make it better. And so the idea is that families should be included in the treatment in some fashion, or to have some family education sessions of their own. The importance of shame and acceptance and compassion were highlighted in this qualitative systematic review as key stigma processes important in psychosis recovery, and it was suggested that the so-called third wave CBT approaches, such as acceptance and commitment therapy and compassion-focused therapy, might be helpful in specifically addressing these things. But it's noted that at this point in time the evidence is lacking, and so it's more important to stick to more conventional CBT. So last year, Toni Morrison published the first pilot RCT of individualised cognitive therapy for self-stigma in people with psychosis. So this therapy used individual case formulation and identified stigma-related goals. The therapy comprised a number of CBT techniques and others from working with people with psychosis. So guided imagery, normalising explanations of psychosis, behavioural experiments to test stigma-related appraisals and negative beliefs about the self and the illness, psychoeducation about psychosis and social anxiety, validation of the experiences that people have been through, particularly in regards to stigma, and also exploration of different ways to respond to stigma and discrimination. So going through the pros and cons of different ways of reacting when coming up against stigma. So the results of this pilot study were that the intervention was highly valued by the participants, and they identified psychoeducation, normalisation, and feeling understood as the most important components. The objective results showed improvement in shame and depression and hopelessness following the intervention, and non-significant but in the right direction improvements in self-stigma and social anxiety measures. So as a pilot study, we will be expecting a larger RCT to emerge before too long, but the results are promising about individualised treatment for stigma, self-stigma in social anxiety and psychosis. So moving on to our other treatment target, that of anti-stigma campaigns. So how can we impact on the stigma that is in society around mental illness and psychosis in particular? So as we noticed, this is something that's been recognised by governments as something that's important to address, and identified by researchers as that public stigma and shame are significant elements in the distress and negative outcomes for consumers, and researchers have been calling for anti-stigma interventions for the general public. So several recent systematic reviews have been published that have been examining the effectiveness of anti-stigma interventions. This is a relatively new field of work. So what sorts of things are tried to address stigma? I guess there are really three types, if you like, of anti-stigma strategies. So the first is education, or if you like, mass media campaigns, where it's attempted to replace myths about mental illness with more accurate knowledge. The second strategy is contact. So this is where direct or indirect contact or interactions with people who have a mental illness are used to challenge the prejudices that are held about people with mental illness. And the third strategy is protest. So this is trying to suppress stigmatising attitudes and representations of mental illness in things like movies and TV shows. So some anti-stigma campaigners write to TV stations and movie production companies and ask them to change their portrayals of people with mental illness. So we know that public campaigns have been run in a variety of Western nations so far, and we have some idea about the effectiveness of those as well. So, for instance, the Beyond Blue campaign about depression in Australia has been one of the most successful and is well known across the world. And it's been associated with an improvement in public attitude and knowledge about depression. And there's been a demonstration of a dose effect, such that the more people have been exposed to the campaign, the more improvement has been seen in attitudes and knowledge about depression. The Like Minds Like Mine anti-stigma program in New Zealand led to overall reduction in discrimination and improved knowledge and attitudes. Another campaign was the See Me campaign that was run in Scotland, and that demonstrated improved attitudes, and they were able to compare that with a similar region in England that didn't have the campaign and see significant differences between the two regions. A more recent campaign in England called Time to Change and in Canada called Opening Minds have reported positive results in knowledge and attitudes, and also increased contact with people with mental illness following these campaigns. So overall the results look positive, but it is relatively new, and we're still unclear about how much these effects endure. So do you need to keep repeating them all the time? Is it a message that's just needs to be heard once? We need to know more about that. Another interesting area of research around anti-stigma campaigns is what the message should be. So until relatively recently, most anti-stigma campaigns have used a biomedical model where a mental illness is talked about and advertised as an illness like any other. But evaluations of this message has suggested that it seems to increase perception of people with mental illness as dangerous and unpredictable, and increases fear and leads people to stay away or increase social distance. So maybe that's not the best message to contain in anti-stigma campaigns. A study that asked professionals what should be included, what the message should be in anti-stigma campaigns, endorsed approaches that were recovery-oriented, so talking about people recovering, that were person-centred, identifying individuals or the individuality of people, as that being more important in tackling stigma. Messages that encourage acceptance of difference, which dispel myths about dangerousness, and which portray mental illness on a continuum, were noted as being important as well. And the study that I referred to before of service users endorsed this approach as well. Anti-stigma campaigns have also targeted specific groups, really chosen on the basis of their potential impact. So there have been a number of campaigns in different places for healthcare professionals because they have a high contact with people with mental illness, and in fact have been found to embody quite a level of stigma about mental illness as well. It's been theorised that that's due to the clinician's perspective, if you like, or the clinician's myth, because clinicians tend to see people when they're at their most unwell, and that they don't have much of a view of people who have recovered and are doing well, and so this leads to a stigmatised view in the healthcare professional group. They've also targeted people in positions of power like police and judges and people in the legal realm. Or there are anti-stigma campaigns that target young people through schools and other places because it's thought that they will take those messages into the future and have a longer term effect. So this is, again, as I said, a relatively new area of research, and evidence is still limited, but the strongest evidence is for contact interventions in specific groups. So interventions where Those groups are meeting people and hearing personal testimonies and interacting with people with mental illness seem to be the best in terms of reducing stigma. For healthcare workers, there was a Canadian evaluation of 37 programs, and they identified the key ingredients as personal testimonies, having multiple contacts with consumers. They talked about it being important to teach people what to say about mental illness and in conversations with consumers. They recommended emphasising or demonstrating recovery and modelling enthusiastic person-centred approaches. So the exception in the literature to this idea about contact being best is for young people and students, where education-based approaches appeared to be more effective than contact. But it is quite a small area of research to date. Okay, so let's go back to our case study that we started with and hear about what happened with Marcus. So Marcus had individual CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, focusing on self-esteem, social anxiety and confidence, including psychoeducation about his psychotic diagnosis and his experience of social anxiety, discussion of the stress vulnerability model of the occurrence of mental illness, discussion about substance use and its role in social anxiety and psychosis, all presented within an ethos, if you like, about optimism regarding recovery. The therapy included behavioural experiments to test his ideas about getting rejected, to test his ability to have conversations, and encouraging him to reduce avoidance. We're very lucky here at Orygen to have a relatively large psychosocial group recovery program, and Marcus utilised this group this program to great advantage. So he began by attending a drop-in social group that happens once a week, where he experienced acceptance, formed friendships, and was able to test some of his negative assumptions about himself and how he would be perceived. He attended an exercise group, which also afforded him socialisation opportunities, but also helped him to increase his confidence in his physical fitness. And he attended a vocational program, which was excellent for his confidence, and he got gained skills and abilities, broadened his interests, and was really, I think, terrific for him improving his confidence and important in his recovery. So after 18 months, he was discharged and was functioning really well. He'd gained an apprenticeship. He had new and old friends. He'd contacted some old friends from his school days. He had a girlfriend, and he had stayed completely off substances well, in fact, he gave up substances pretty much as soon as he came into the service, but did have a few little tries along the way, but on discharge he had given it away completely. So just reviewing about what happened with Marcus, it is only a single case example, but I think it's a good example of addressing stigma and how this seemed to be important in his recovery. And as I've said, I think the group program provides an excellent opportunity for challenging self-stigma, for testing negative assumptions, and building skills and relationships in an optimistic, hopeful and supportive environment where there are lots of other young people who are at different stages of recovery, but many of them model where young people with mental illness can get to in their recovery. I'm a big fan of group programs as a really important part of recovery from psychosis. Sorry, I've been going for a long time now. Just in conclusion then, what we've covered today, what I hope has come through, is that social anxiety is a significant problem for a large minority of people with early psychosis. Stigma, both in society generally and internalised as self-stigma, is an important treatment target for social anxiety and psychosis. CBT for social anxiety, modified to include a focus on stigma, appears most appropriate for those with psychosis and social anxiety. A detailed assessment of the experience and effects of stigma should always be included when working with people with mental illness. Continued and expanded efforts to address mental illness stigma within the wider community will improve the lives of those with mental illness and may reduce comorbid social anxiety. And as with just about everything, we need more research to know how to do this more effectively and more cost effectively as well. Thank you. I'll hand you back to Kelly for a minute.
Well, shall I? Yeah, you can sit next to me. Thank you, Shona. So before we maybe we have a little discussion about what you've just presented today, I just wanted to alert you to our on-site workshops and consultation services that are available. So please visit the website, and you can also contact us via that email address there for further details of further learning opportunities and other consultation opportunities. So we didn't have there were no sort of specific questions coming forward, but I had a few questions that sort of came up that I thought maybe we could touch on before we finish up today. So I know at the start you talked about the cause and you know, whether social anxiety was sort of a consequence or a cause of psychosis. In your experience, you know, what would you say, you know, is the common, just sum up again or remind us about the common sort of theories around, or theory around that?
Yes, I guess the main idea that I've been advancing is that social anxiety can be a consequence of developing psychosis. Mm-hmm. But of course, people who develop psychosis have long histories before they come in. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they might develop them in their teenagers, not that long. And that many people experience social anxiety or shyness as young people, and depending on the severity of that, it could be a cause of stress, and that stress is implicated in the onset of psychosis. Yeah. So although there is an argument to say that it comes on after psychosis, it may well be present before as well. And I'm not sure that would change the treatment approaches anyway. Yeah. I think it's important. I guess the additional thing is the stigma of psychosis, which I think is very important to address both at an individual level and also in the community more generally.
Yeah, okay. So on that question or that topic around stigma, so I've just noticed clinically that clients won't use the term stigma, or they don't often say I feel stigmatized, or you know, they don't sort of refer to it in that way. And there's times when you might kind of have that feeling with a client that they're feeling stigmatized, or there's certainly a lot of self-stigma going on. How do you broach the topic? Because you talked about in your summary the need to sort of address the experience of stigma and how the young person might deal with that. Do you use the term stigma, or you know, how do you kind of go about assessing that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, which I haven't reflected on before. I don't think I do use the word stigma when I'm working with young people, which is who I work with, and their families, of course, unless they do. But you're right, I don't think it comes up very often. So we would talk about how they talk to their friends about what's happened to them. Over the course of treatment, talk to them about what the labels around what's happened to them might be. What does psychosis mean to them? What does it mean to other people in their lives, their family and their friends? Do they know other people who've had psychosis? Do they know any of the other diagnostic labels? Have they heard of schizophrenia? And to explore all of those terms and labels and the impact that has on them too. So to ask them how they feel about those things and what they thought before they became unwell, what they think now. Yeah. Often young people with first episode psychosis do have a relative somewhere in their background that have had a mental illness, and they may have experienced some quite negative things, and that times have changed, and that there's early intervention and there's better treatments these days. So it can often be important to help young people realise that they're not going to go through exactly the same course that their relative has before.
Yeah. So you're really just focusing on their experiences and the terms that they use, and that's the language you use within the sessions and the things that you draw on and what you work on.
Yep.
That's
very
great.
much so.
Yeah. Okay. I had one more question, was around the length of CBT. So you did talk about in young people that it wasn't about the number of sessions, but the length of the intervention that seemed to be associated with outcomes, with the CBT outcomes for social anxiety. Do you know much about sort of how long could it take? I mean, I know how long's a piece of string, but when in your experience, can it be in a few sessions that you could address social anxiety? Are we talking 18 months or?
No, it's a very good question. So I guess with social anxiety disorder just on its own, generally the recommendations are around 4 months, around 16 sessions, 12 to 16 sessions. The people in anxiety clinics usually can demonstrate a good effect at that point in time. The difference with someone with psychosis is quite marked, I think, because there's a variety of other issues going on, and we like to follow up people with psychosis for much longer. And in our service here, it's 18 months to 2 years, and I think the social anxiety treatment, if you like, is woven within all the other bits and pieces that are going on as well. So it's a special case.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Shona. So looks like we've run out of time, so I'll just finish up here. Thank you, and really appreciate your thoughtful presentation today. I just wanted to flag with the listeners that we have one more session or webinar coming up on anxiety disorders. It'll be presented by Associate Professor Ben Harrison, and it'll be on the neuroscience of anxiety disorder. So looking forward to, hopefully you can join us for that one. That's in 2 weeks' time. And then following that, we have another series on a different topic, which will be on physical and sexual health and their relationship to mental health, with a couple of keynote speakers we have lined up for that session or those sessions. So just a reminder that they're free and you can register by visiting our webpage. So thank you very much for your attendance. We hope you found the information valuable. As I said earlier, we have recorded the webinar, and it will be available online, and we'll email you and let you know when that's available. And we'll also email you your certificate of participation, which will be sent to you shortly. Following this webinar, we do have a brief survey, and we'd really appreciate your feedback if you have time. Okay, thank you.